they called her race of people the Moors. And the Moors are, and I just saw it again. I was just like, yo, if you erase our history, like most black people, we don't know where we come. We think we came from slaves.
Europe was once ruled by black kings, scientists, and warriors, but history erased them. They were called Moors. They built empires in Spain, shaped science and medicine, and sparked the Renaissance centuries before it began. Yet today, their story is missing from classrooms, museums, and national memory. Who were these people? How did they rise? And why were they erased? Let's find out. Firstly, who were the Moors, really? To answer the question of what happened to the black people of Europe, we first have to look deeper into who they were, not just what they were called, because Moor was never a race. It wasn't even a nationality. It was a label, a word Europeans used to describe the Muslim populations of North and West Africa who entered Europe beginning in the 8th century. But over time, it became something more, a symbol of power, of mystery, and later, of fear. Let's be clear, the Moors were a multi-ethnic, multicultural civilization, but at the heart of that civilization were black Africans. Many were warriors from the Sahel and Sudan regions. Others were scholars, traders, diplomats, and religious leaders from places like Timbuktu, Gao, and ancient Ghana. They came to Europe not as slaves or refugees, but as conquerors, governors, and engineers. And once they arrived, they stayed for centuries. Most modern retellings suggest that the Moors were primarily Arab, but this is a historical distortion. The Arab armies that initially entered Iberia in 711 were small. The bulk of the Islamic expansion into Europe came through North African Berber and Black African forces, often converts to Islam who brought with them distinct languages, cultures, and military traditions. These were men and women who did not fit Europe's image of itself, and yet they helped reshape it entirely. European writers from the medieval period described them in ways that are impossible to ignore. They called them black as coal, with woolly hair, dark-skinned, or of Ethiopic appearance. These weren't insults. These were identifiers. For example, the Black Moors of the Taifa kingdoms, the small Islamic states of Spain after the Umayyad collapse, frequently served as military commanders and even royal bodyguards to Muslim emirs and kings. They weren't invisible, they were essential, but their roles went far beyond the battlefield. Black Moors were intellectuals and administrators who governed cities, organized trade networks that reached into sub-Saharan Africa, and contributed to the development of Europe's first public libraries, hospitals, and gardens. In cities like Toledo, Zaragoza, and Cordoba, Black Moors participated in legal courts, taught in madrasas, and even offered refuge to Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere in Europe. What's more revealing is how they were viewed by Europeans of the time. Unlike later centuries, when blackness was equated with inferiority, early medieval Europe associated the Moors with power, prestige, and even romance. In medieval epics like the Song of Roland or El Cid, the Moors appear as noble enemies, regal, skilled, and intelligent. Even European coats of arms from Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and Sardinia still bear the image of the Moor's head, a silent echo of a time when blackness was not foreign but familiar. Of course, this visibility made them dangerous, at least ideologically. Their presence contradicted the very myth Europe would later construct, that it alone birthed civilization, that Christianity was the sole torchbearer of knowledge, and that black people had always been subservient. The Moors shattered this myth. They weren't supposed to be literate, let alone astronomers or architects, and yet they were all of that and more. As time went on, European art began to reflect this discomfort. Where once the Moors had been painted in bright robes and golden turbans, later works began to cast them in shadows. Their features were exaggerated, their roles diminished. By the Renaissance, the Moor had become a costume in a court mask. Exotic, silent, and controlled. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, intentional, and incredibly effective. But before their erasure became complete, the Black Moors left behind a visible trail of evidence in art, in literature, in the stones of castles and mosques, and even in European family trees. To know who the Moors were is to understand how much of Europe was built in their image, only for that image to be destroyed. So now that we know who they really were, we must ask the next question. What exactly did they build during their rule, and how far did their influence go? Once the Moors arrived in Europe, they did not merely conquer, they constructed. They reshaped the very fabric of European life, not just through warfare, but through engineering, urban planning, intellectual infrastructure, and cultural refinement. Their legacy isn't just etched in books, it's carved in stone, flowing through aqueducts, and buried in the architectural bones of cities that still stand today. And yet, few realize that much of what Europe celebrates today as its medieval charm has deep Moorish origins. Let's begin with their most visible legacy: architecture. The Moors introduced an entirely new architectural language to Europe, one that defied the cold, brutalist stone of early medieval Europe. They brought with them the geometry of grace, elegant arches, domes, flowing fountains, courtyards, and intricate tilework. Their buildings were not just shelters. They were symbols of harmony, mathematics, and divine beauty. The Alhambra Palace in Granada is perhaps the most iconic. Built as a fortress and then transformed into a royal palace, it showcases muqarnas ceilings, calligraphy-laced walls, symmetrical courtyards, and water flowing through every level of the structure, engineered to cool the palace naturally in the Andalusian heat. But the Alhambra is only one of hundreds. Across southern Spain, cities like Ronda, Malaga, Seville, and Jaén still retain palaces, mosques, now cathedrals, and bathhouses built by Moorish hands. What few realize is that city planning itself was revolutionized under Moorish rule. The Moors introduced street lighting, underground sewer systems, paved roads, and zoned districts, centuries before these features would appear in the rest of Europe. In Córdoba, public baths were common, and many homes had running water. In contrast, Paris was still a city of mud and wooden huts. The Moors also built schools, libraries, and observatories, infrastructure for the mind. The Library of Córdoba is said to have held over 400,000 volumes, an astonishing number at a time when most European kings could not read. Knowledge wasn't just preserved, it was produced. Astronomy towers like the Giraldillo in Seville weren't just decorative. They were scientific instruments, aligned with celestial movements for precise astronomical calculations. And then there were the gardens. The Moors didn't just grow food, they sculpted paradise on earth. Inspired by Islamic concepts of heaven, they created symmetrical gardens with flowing water, fragrant flowers, and shaded pavilions. These gardens weren't ornamental, they reflected a spiritual philosophy, one that viewed nature as a reflection of divine order. The Generalife Gardens in Granada and the Huerta de la Alcazaba in Almería are still visited today, but their deeper meanings are rarely taught. Beyond aesthetics, the Moors built systems, especially in agriculture and irrigation. They introduced terrace farming, water wheels, and qanats, underground canals, enabling farming in arid climates. Thanks to these innovations, Spain became one of the most agriculturally productive regions in medieval Europe. New crops such as rice, sugarcane, cotton, and citrus fruits transformed the European diet forever. One cannot overlook the economic infrastructure they established either. Moorish cities had organized marketplaces with fixed pricing, quality control, and even early versions of credit and documentation. Contracts, bills of sale, and notary systems thrived. The Moors used currency minted with precise Islamic geometry and calligraphy, not just for trade, but as cultural tools of identity and stability. But perhaps the most significant thing they built was a culture of tolerance, an ecosystem where Muslims, Jews, and Christians coexisted, exchanged ideas, and lived under laws that, while not equal, were more inclusive than anything Christian Europe offered at the time. Synagogues flourished in Cordoba. Jewish philosophers debated openly in Seville. Christian communities paid tribute but retained their churches and customs. This wasn't utopia, but it was a rare space of pluralism in a world otherwise ruled by religious fanaticism. The material proof of what the Moors built is still visible, but the intellectual scaffolding they left behind is less obvious and more important. They built the groundwork for the European Renaissance centuries before it began. Universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford would later draw upon translated Moorish texts, filtered through Toledo's scriptoria and libraries, to teach the very knowledge they once denounced as foreign. So, when we ask what the Moors built, the answer is not just palaces, mosques, or gardens. They built the bones of modern Europe. Roads, sewers, libraries, farms, science, mathematics, cities, philosophy, literacy, trade. They built not only with stone, but with vision. But the question remains, how could all of this, so massive, so visible, be erased? Here's a quick reminder. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful Black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. It is one thing to lose a war. It is another to have your existence rewritten, your face repainted, and your memory shattered across centuries. The Moors did not vanish. They were systematically erased. After centuries of innovation, construction, and cultural leadership, their downfall didn't begin with swords. It began with narrative control. And that is where Europe's greatest weapon, the pen, the pulpit, and the brush, was deployed. The process of erasure began after the final Moorish stronghold, Granada, fell to Christian forces in 1492. But even before that, the push to expel not only Islam but all traces of African and non-Christian influence had already started. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, did more than conquer. They launched an ideological purge. One of the first moves was the destruction of knowledge. Entire libraries were torched. In 1499, Cardinal Cisneros led the burning of tens of thousands of Arabic manuscripts in public squares. Books that held centuries of scientific, medical, and philosophical knowledge were deemed heretical simply because they came from Muslim hands. The intellectual infrastructure built by the Moors was not just ignored, it was annihilated. Then came the linguistic erasure. The Arabic language, once spoken fluently across cities like Toledo and Zaragoza, was criminalized. Speaking Arabic could result in imprisonment or worse. Even names were targeted. Moors were forced to adopt Spanish Christian names under threat of death. Cities, streets, and monuments were renamed or rebranded, disconnecting them from their original creators. The visual erasure followed. Religious art began to depict the Moor not as a wise scholar or regal warrior, but as a cartoonish villain, often shown dark-skinned, turbaned, and grotesque. This wasn't just character assassination, it was iconographic warfare. The once noble image of the Black Moor was transformed into a warning. This is what happens to outsiders, to heretics, to those who do not conform. This was especially evident in public festivals and royal performances. In medieval pageants and plays, the Moor became a caricature, the perpetual enemy in stories where good Christian knights slayed the infidel. These performances weren't harmless entertainment. They were political theater, engineered to train generations to see Moors as monsters, not as ancestors of civilization. but the most brutal part of the erasure was biological. In the 16th century, the Spanish crown began forcibly converting Muslims to Christianity, creating a new group known as the Moriscos. These were former Moors stripped of their faith, culture, and in time, identity, but suspicion remained. Even baptized Moriscos were watched closely, their homes raided, their traditions banned. Things as simple as cooking couscous, wearing certain fabrics, or bathing frequently were used as proof that someone was secretly still a Moor. Then came the final blow: expulsion. Between 1609 and 1614, more than 300,000 Moriscos, many with deep roots in Spain for generations, were forcibly removed. Families were ripped apart, land was confiscated, wealth was stolen, and as they were driven out, the Spanish government destroyed their community records, leaving no trace of where they had lived, traded, or taught. This was not just about religion, it was about race and heritage. The darker-skinned Moors were often the first to be expelled, targeted specifically for their phenotype. This points to a more chilling reality: early racialization in Europe, long before the transatlantic slave trade became dominant. What followed was a campaign of rewriting. Historians began to attribute Moorish achievements to Christian rulers. Mosques were called churches with Islamic influence. Bathhouses became Roman innovations. Mathematics textbooks removed Arabic origin terms. Public memory was scrubbed clean. And perhaps most insidious of all was the romanticization of the Moor, once their power had been broken. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Moorish architecture and design became exoticized in Europe. Palaces, costumes, even tea sets were decorated in a Moorish style. But the actual people, the black, African-origin Moors, they were absent from the picture. The art form remained. The artist was forgotten. By the time European nationalism took root in the 19th century, the idea of a pure Christian white Europe had become dominant. That image could not afford to acknowledge that for centuries its civilization had been built by those it now called inferior. This wasn't accidental. It was a long, coordinated civilizational cover-up. So now we ask, if Europe tried so hard to erase them, did any part of the Black Moorish legacy survive? And where can we still find it today? Europe may have tried to erase the Moors, but history, no matter how buried, leaves residue. Even after centuries of suppression, traces of the Black Moors remain, hidden in plain sight, scattered across art, architecture, language, music, and even DNA. Though the official record attempted to scrub them away, the evidence of their existence is stubborn, woven into the very fabric of Europe's foundations. You just have to know where to look. Let's start with architecture, not in palaces this time, but in the unexpected. Look closely at the bell towers of southern Spain. They tilt like minarets. The horseshoe arch, long assumed to be a European Gothic invention, is a distinctly Moorish feature, adapted from North African mosque designs. Walk the streets of Seville, and you'll find arabesque tiles, water gardens, and even inscriptions in Arabic script etched faintly into weathered stones, too obscure to attract attention, too deeply embedded to be removed without tearing down the walls. These are architectural fossils, remnants of a presence too vast to vanish completely. Then there's language. In modern Spanish, over 4,000 words are of Arabic origin, introduced during the centuries of Moorish rule. But it's not just Arabic influence, it's Africanized Arabic, filtered through the dialects of the Sahel and Maghreb. Words like aceituna for olive, azúcar for sugar, ayadres for chess, and alcalde for mayor aren't just linguistic trivia. They're fingerprints of a black Islamic civilization that administrated, cultivated, and intellectualized Iberian life. Even the prefix al, which begins hundreds of Spanish words, is a relic of Arabic grammar left behind like ghostly signatures. Music also carries their legacy. The Spanish flamenco, often romanticized as purely Andalusian or gypsy, has rhythmic roots in Moorish and African musical traditions. The melismatic singing, percussive hand claps or palmas, and intricate footwork bear the unmistakable influence of North African Nawa music and West African polyrhythms. This was music carried by people through trade routes, through migration, and yes, through conquest. Today's flamenco dancers echo movements that once accompanied Moorish festivals, weddings, and spiritual rites, though most have no idea where the rhythms come from. Even European coats of arms and regional flags still carry forgotten emblems of the Moors. The most striking is the Moor's head, featured in the flags of Sardinia and Corsica. These are not caricatures, but once proud symbols, profile portraits of African men adorned with earrings and turbans, once representing dignity and resistance. Today, they're controversial, often misunderstood, and politically downplayed, but their presence alone proves the symbolic centrality of Black Moors in the European consciousness before erasure distorted their meaning. There's also what lies beneath the skin. Genetic studies in Spain and Portugal, particularly in the southern regions of Andalusia and the Algarve, have revealed North African and sub-Saharan DNA markers in significant percentages of the population. These aren't modern imports, they're ancestral echoes. Many families unknowingly carry traces of intermarriage, cultural mixing, and shared bloodlines with the Moors, preserved in mitochondrial DNA. The erasure may have succeeded on paper, but not in the body. The family trees of several Spanish noble houses include hidden Moorish branches. Names were changed, lineage records altered, and skin tones painted over. But in recent years, scholars have begun to reconstruct these hidden genealogies, tracing the African roots of families once thought to be purely European. Even Alessandro de' Medici, the 16th century Duke of Florence, carried African ancestry on his mother's side, a truth that resurfaced only centuries later. Then there's art, not in the museums, but in the margins. Manuscripts from medieval monasteries contain illustrations of Black knights, saints, and scholars, usually anonymous but carefully drawn. In some cathedrals, stained glass windows depict Black figures with halos, remnants of a time when holiness was not equated with whiteness. These images were later modified or hidden, but not all were removed. Some remain in shadowed corners, in half-forgotten chapels still watching. And let's not forget the oral histories, passed down quietly, away from textbooks. In the Andalusian countryside, older generations speak of the old ones who came from Africa, of ruined buildings they call morerias, places once inhabited by Moors, and of strange family traditions, recipes, wedding songs, herbal medicine that have no traceable European origin. These fragments may not satisfy academic rigor, but they keep the memory alive. In the modern age, digital archaeology and open-source scholarship are bringing the Black Moors back into the conversation. From local historians uploading documents online to activists uncovering hidden graves and tomb inscriptions, the buried truth is beginning to resurface. Even AI and image recognition tools are now helping to identify and reconstruct Moorish elements once dismissed or misattributed. Europe never fully erased the Moors. It covered them, renamed them, and misfiled them. But enough traces remain to piece together the truth. So the next question must be asked. If the evidence of their existence still lingers, why has Europe refused to publicly acknowledge their blackness? If the traces are everywhere, etched into stone, embedded in language, sewn into flags, and even woven into European DNA, why does Europe still hesitate, even refuse to say it outright? Why won't it admit that the Moors, many of them, were Black Africans? The answer is not ignorance. It's ideology. To acknowledge that Black people once ruled parts of Europe administered cities, advanced science, and influenced Western civilization, would shatter centuries of carefully constructed Eurocentric narratives. These narratives weren't formed by accident. They were strategically built, especially during the rise of European nationalism, colonialism, and scientific racism. Let's go back. By the 17th and 18th centuries, after the expulsion of the Moriscos, after the burning of Arabic texts, and after the rewriting of Moorish contributions as European triumphs, Europe found itself in a new era, one of global conquest. The age of empire was dawning. The slave trade was expanding. Colonization was being rationalized. To justify the mass enslavement of Africans and the violent occupation of their lands, Europe had to believe and convince others that black people were inherently inferior, that they were non-intellectual, non-rational, non-human even. But how could that narrative survive if Europe had to admit that these same people once ruled them? It couldn't. So denial became a tool of the empire. History books were rewritten to describe the Moors as Arab invaders, deliberately omitting or downplaying the sub-Saharan African presence. When the term Moor was used, it became ethnically vague, a safe word to obscure blackness. And when visual depictions of black Moors were too obvious to ignore, artists began to recast them, not as rulers or scholars, but as servants, jesters, or footnotes in someone else's story. And this wasn't limited to Spain. In England, Shakespeare's Othello, originally a nuanced black general, was increasingly portrayed by white actors in blackface, his complexity reduced to stereotype. In France, Orientalist art became popular, fetishizing Moors as exotic, decadent, or dangerous, but never civilized, never European, never equals. In Germany and the Netherlands, black saints faded out of stained glass or were renamed entirely. The black presence was slowly reimagined as an anomaly, never a foundation. The silence became institutional. European schools omitted the Moorish era from curricula, or taught it only as a period of foreign occupation, ignoring the fact that it laid the intellectual groundwork for the Renaissance. Museums reclassified Islamic artifacts from Spain as Middle Eastern to avoid associating them with African creators. Archaeological finds in Spain and Portugal showing African ancestry were buried in academic journals instead of being introduced to the public. Even BBC and European documentaries discussing the Moors tend to avoid the word black altogether, choosing instead Muslim, North African, or simply Moors, allowing ambiguity to conceal the racial truth. But there's a deeper reason for the denial: psychological continuity. Europe's self-image is built on a timeline that flows smoothly from Greek genius to Roman law, through Christian kings, into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and then into modern Western dominance. It's a neat story, a story of unbroken whiteness. Insert the Black Moors into this line and the entire sequence is disrupted. Suddenly, the Renaissance has African roots. The Enlightenment is built on Islamic philosophy. European medicine has African scholars in its ancestry. This isn't just a historical correction, it's an existential crisis. The denial also serves a modern political function. If Europe admits to a deep positive African influence, then today's anti-immigration narratives collapse. The fear of African migrants, the myth that Europe is being invaded by foreign cultures, these would be laughable if Europe acknowledged that Africans had not only been here before, but had governed, contributed, and shaped its golden eras. This denial is why artworks showing black nobility are hidden in storage, why African ancestry in European royals is rarely discussed, and why scholars like Runoko Rashidi or Ivan van Sertima are considered controversial despite producing mountains of evidence. Because admitting the truth doesn't just change the past, it changes the power dynamics of the present, and that is dangerous to those who benefit from historical amnesia. So we are left with whispers. Moorish heads on flags, forgotten songs, abandoned architecture, misunderstood saints. The truth never left, it was just pushed into the shadows. But here's the twist. While Europe continues to deny the blackness of the Moors, black people themselves around the world are rediscovering it. So what happens when the descendants of the erased begin to reclaim what was stolen? That's the question we now face. For hundreds of years, the Black Moors were written out of European memory, but now their descendants are writing them back in. Across Africa, the Americas, and Europe, Black communities are rising with one shared goal: to reclaim what was stolen, their history, their identity, and the truth. This reclamation isn't coming from government archives or university boards. It's coming from Black researchers, artists, youth, and visionaries who are tired of being told they have no roots in greatness. And instead of waiting for permission, they're opening doors the world thought were sealed shut. It starts with a hunger for truth. Black scholars, many working outside traditional academic institutions, are sifting through forgotten manuscripts, ancient texts, and censored archives. They are uncovering evidence that was deliberately ignored. Court records, tax documents, old maps, and travelers' accounts that speak plainly of Black rulers, Black scientists, Black warriors who once held power in Europe. Books like Ivan van Sertima's The Golden Age of the Moor and Runoko Rashidi's work on African global presence sparked this fire. They didn't just tell stories, they exposed lies and permitted Black readers to see themselves not as victims of history, but as the authors of it. From there, the movement spread into art and culture, where resistance thrives without censorship. Across the diaspora, artists are breathing life into Moorish identity, repainting history through a Black lens. Fashion designers are reviving Moorish aesthetics, from flowing robes and turbans to jewelry inspired by Al-Andalus. Photographers stage royal portraits of Black Moors, not as fantasy, but as rightful inheritance. Filmmakers and animators are creating new heroes based on real Moorish leaders, bringing their forgotten stories to the screen. In music, Andalusian influences are being reinterpreted in African American jazz, West African string instruments, and even Caribbean rhythms. The sound of Moorish memory is resurfacing, reworked through the global beat of the African soul. And then there's the digital battleground. On platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, a new generation is using short videos to educate millions. Young Black creators are explaining how the Moors revolutionized agriculture, how African DNA is still present in Iberia, or why coats of arms in Europe show Black faces. These videos bypass academic gatekeeping. They go straight to the people, unfiltered, visual, and real. But the movement isn't just creative, it's spiritual and personal too. Some Black communities are going beyond history books. They're asking deeper questions. What did our ancestors believe? What did they eat, wear, build, and celebrate? From travel groups visiting Andalusian palaces to the reconstruction of Moorish customs in Black Muslim and Afro-Islamic circles, people are reconnecting with a stolen spiritual legacy. Even in the U.S., where the Moorish Science Temple of America laid early claims to Moorish ancestry in the 20th century, a new wave of seekers is revisiting its message that Black people in the Americas descend from a powerful, noble civilization, not slaves without a past. Education is shifting too. Afrocentric schools and homeschool networks are now placing the Moors alongside African empires like Mali, Songhai, and Kemet. For the first time, Black children are learning that while Europe was burning witches and bleeding patients, Black Moors were performing surgery, calculating star maps, and running international trade routes. Even in Europe, the ground is shifting. In Spain, France, Portugal, and Italy, Black communities are hosting walking tours that highlight erased Black histories. They're pointing out mosques turned churches, statues of Black saints repainted white, and neighborhoods where Black Moors once lived but are never mentioned. These tours aren't just historical, they're political. They reclaim space. All of this matters because when you control your history, you control your identity. And when that identity is rooted in truth, not shame, it becomes a weapon. This reclamation is not nostalgia, it's resistance. It's a message to the world. We were never just enslaved people. We were rulers, builders, thinkers, warriors. We were the Moors. But as black people reclaim this truth, it raises a deeper question. What happens to Europe's self-image, the myth of white Christian purity, once this story comes out? For a continent that has spent centuries constructing a myth of racial and cultural purity, the return of the Moors isn't just a historical correction. It's a direct challenge to Europe's identity, politics, and pride. This confrontation is already happening, quietly but unmistakably. Across southern Europe, the physical remains of Moorish civilization are no longer just tourist sites. They are battlegrounds of memory. Cities like Granada, Seville, and Córdoba have turned former mosques into monuments, rebranded them as Christian triumphs, and sanitized their origin stories. Tour guides might mention Moorish influence, but rarely utter the word African. The arches are admired, the fountains are photographed, but the black hands that carved them, forgotten. And this isn't just about the past. The refusal to confront Moorish blackness is deeply tied to Europe's discomfort with its present reality: migration, multiculturalism, and the growing visibility of African and Muslim populations across the continent. In modern Spain, France, and Italy, where African and Arab migrants struggle against racism, segregation, and economic exclusion, acknowledging the truth about the Moors would force Europe to reckon with a contradiction. It would mean admitting that the very people it now marginalizes once defined European civilization, that the foreigners knocking on Europe's door are returning to a home their ancestors helped build, and that realization is politically dangerous. Because it cuts to the root of Europe's nationalist narratives, especially those growing louder in recent years. Far-right parties across the continent, from Spain's Vox to France's National Rally to Italy's Brothers of Italy, thrive on myths of a once pure Christian Europe under siege. They sell fear of Islamization, of Africanization, of cultural dilution. These myths only work if history is kept clean and simple. The Moors, especially the Black Moors, make it messy. Admitting the truth forces a new perspective, that Europe was never pure, never isolated, never racially homogeneous. It has always been a melting point of exchange, sometimes violent, sometimes cooperative, but undeniably mixed. That its golden ages were not born in isolation, but in contact, conquest, and collaboration with Africa. This truth threatens the comfort of national pride. What does it mean for Spain's narrative of Reconquista if the people they expelled were not just Muslims, but Africans who had brought light to the land? What does it mean for Italy's Roman legacy if centuries of knowledge were preserved, enhanced, and reintroduced through black scholars from Al-Andalus and the Maghreb? What does it mean for the Renaissance if it owes a debt not just to Greece and Rome, but to black intellect and science filtered through Moorish libraries? This isn't simply about guilt, it's about accountability, because the denial of this history doesn't just distort the past, it continues to fuel discrimination in the present. If Europe had acknowledged long ago that Africans once governed with intelligence, dignity, and power, would anti-black racism look different today? Would African immigrants be seen as partners instead of problems? There are signs of change, but they are slow and often cosmetic. Some European museums have begun adding Islamic art wings, though they rarely emphasize the African identities of the creators. School curricula in certain regions now briefly mention the Moors, but as a period rather than a people. Some universities are offering courses on decolonial history, but few tackle the full weight of Europe's internal colonization, the erasure of blackness from its soil. Meanwhile, grassroots movements, often led by Europe's African diaspora, are pressing harder. Public lectures, street art, social media campaigns, and local exhibitions are reclaiming narratives from below. They're not asking for permission, they're demanding a reckoning. Because the question is no longer whether the Moors were black. That evidence is overwhelming. The real question is, what will Europe do now that the truth is resurfacing? Will it cling to its myth of whiteness, patching the cracks with new lies? Or will it evolve, finally, into a continent capable of facing its true past and building a future that honors it? What happens next doesn't just affect Black Europeans or African immigrants. It affects everyone, because a continent built on half-truths can't sustain itself. Sooner or later, the walls fall. And now that the Moors have returned, not in armies, but in memory, those walls are shaking. Do you think it's even possible to erase a legacy this deep? If the West tried to bury this history, what else might they have hidden? Let us know in the comment section. Will you keep believing their whitewashed version of the past, or will you start questioning it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.